There comes a peculiar moment in the life of a person when they have exhausted all strategies, strained every muscle of will, and tightened every knot of control, yet still the current of life resists them. They have read the books, whispered affirmations, tried routines, abandoned routines, and still the same patterns persist like an echo that will not die. At such a moment, something remarkable begins to dawn, an intuition that perhaps the effort itself is the barrier, that life is not a machine to be forced into function, but a mystery that reveals itself only when one stops trying to solve it. The unconscious already knows. This statement, when viewed through the deep lens of the psyche, is not merely a poetic sentiment, but a fundamental reality of the inner life. The conscious mind, with its narrowed beam of attention and linear reasoning, believes itself to be the master of reality. It acts, decides, measures, and evaluates, continuously scanning the surface of experience for signs of control. Yet behind it, beneath it, and surrounding it, lies a vast and ancient force that governs with a different logic, one that is not visible to the ego, not accessible by intellect, but no less precise, no less intentional. This force is the unconscious. The unconscious is not a chaotic reservoir of repressed emotions and forgotten dreams, as the superficial mind often assumes. It is an ordered dynamic system, interwoven with instinct, archetype, memory, and purpose. It carries within it the pattern of the individual's life, the trajectory of psychological evolution, and the blueprint for inner wholeness. The ego believes it must figure everything out, but it is often only catching glimpses of a design already in motion, a path already drawn long before it began asking questions. The need to control, to know, to fix, arises from fear. The fear that without intervention everything will collapse. But what collapses under non-intervention is not the truth of life. It is the illusion that we are meant to command it. There is a secret intelligence within the psyche that draws to itself precisely what it needs for growth. This is not always visible on the surface, because the logic of the unconscious does not cater to the desires of comfort, success, or linear progress. It follows a symbolic rhythm. It communicates not in commands but in images, dreams, intuitions, and synchronicities. The ego, believing it must climb higher, achieve more, or perfect its behavior, often misses the fact that the very suffering it is trying to escape has been placed on its path by the deeper self as a teacher, not as a punishment. The unconscious brings forward what the conscious mind most needs to face, not what it prefers to experience. When one reaches a point of frustration, exhaustion, or existential fatigue from constant striving, it is often not a failure but a calling. It is the psyche's way of saying, enough. Be still, let what must rise, rise. But the ego, which thrives on doing, on controlling, on predicting outcomes, resists this stillness. It interprets surrender as passivity, and assumes that if nothing is done, nothing will change. Yet within the deep systems of the soul, surrender is not abandonment. It is participation in the greater intelligence already at work. This is why many transformations occur when one stops trying to transform. The very effort to change one's life, if it comes from fear or egoic insecurity, may actually delay the change. But when that effort is dropped, not out of apathy, but from a deeper trust, the unconscious is allowed to speak freely. The inner world no longer has to shout over the noise of frantic doing. It begins to send up images, revelations, and emotions that were previously blocked by the defensive posturing of control. And these images are not random. They are guided. They carry with them fragments of the self's desire for wholeness. The unconscious is not against you. It is not some wild, sabotaging force that seeks to throw you into darkness. What feels like sabotage is often a correction. The loss that derails your plans, the illness that halts your productivity, the relationship that ends without reason. These events from the standpoint of ego feel like tragedies, but from the standpoint of the deeper self, they are often intervention. They are a calling back to what you have forgotten. They are disruptions designed to recenter you toward your essence. When you stop trying to interfere with this process, when you do nothing differently and instead begin to observe, to listen, to reflect, the deeper patterns of your life begin to reveal themselves. You begin to notice repeating symbols, strange coincidences, and meaningful encounters. What once appeared random begins to feel intentional. This is the effect of aligning with the unconscious rather than resisting it. And it does not require external change, but internal alignment. The notion that you must become something else to be whole is one of the most pervasive illusions of modern thought. It is a misunderstanding rooted in the ego's need to possess, to compare, to outpace its own imagined limitations. But the truth is that wholeness is not achieved through acquisition. It is remembered through reconnection. The unconscious already knows who you are. It holds your forgotten wisdom, your original face before the world told you who you should be. And this face is not waiting to be constructed. It is waiting to be uncovered. You are not tasked with creating your purpose from scratch. You are asked to surrender into it. To do this, you must allow silence to exist. You must let yourself be uncomfortable with not knowing. You must resist the urge to fix what is not broken, and instead turn inward to the wound that won't stop speaking. This wound is not simply pain. It is direction. It points to what has not been integrated, what remains in shadow. And the unconscious, which stores the totality of your psychic life, knows how to bring that wound to light at the right moment, in the right way, through the right mirror. This is why relationships, crises, and dreams are often so revelatory. They are not accidents. They are chosen instruments of the unconscious. The people you attract, the conflicts you endure, the symbols that rise from your sleep, all of them serve the greater work of the soul. But this work cannot be done when the ego insists on dominating every decision. When you relax that grip, when you stop needing to change everything immediately, what arises instead is trust. And with trust comes vision. You begin to see that even your mistakes were part of the process. Even your failures contained seeds of insight that could not have been obtained otherwise. It is a radical idea that doing nothing differently can lead to change. But that is only because our idea of doing is skewed. True inner work does not always look like external movement. Sometimes it looks like quiet observation, like waiting without anxiety, like allowing emotion to rise and pass without judgment. These are not passive acts. They are courageous acts. To not interfere is often harder than to act. It requires faith in something larger than the ego's plan. It requires belief in the wisdom of the unconscious. There is no formula for this trust. It cannot be mimicked or faked. It emerges when the soul has seen enough to know that it cannot outsmart its own depths. When you have tried everything, and nothing remains but silence, that is when the unconscious can finally speak. And what it says is never quite what the ego expects. It speaks in images, not commands. It guides through suggestion, not control. It whispers where the ego shouts. But its guidance, when heard, reorders the entire structure of perception. It reveals that you were never off course, only blind to the map. The unconscious already knows. It knew from the moment you were born what you would need to encounter in this life. It does not demand that you chase your destiny with violence. It asks only that you meet your life as it is, with openness, with curiosity, and with a willingness to descend into yourself, rather than escape into distraction. This descent is the true work. Not the work of becoming something new, but the work of reclaiming what has always been. The world will tell you to change yourself. The unconscious tells you to remember yourself. And this remembrance does not begin with doing, but with being. Not with striving, but with stillness. When you finally realize that the impulse to constantly improve is itself the veil over your essence, you begin to let go. And in that letting go, something ancient awakens. It stirs not with urgency but with depth. It does not rush, because it knows the way. It has been waiting. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are being guided, always have been, always will be. The only task is to stop interfering, to allow the knowing within you to surface, to trust that doing nothing differently is sometimes the exact prescription the soul requires to reset its compass and reveal the destination it had in mind all along. When the human being feels the compulsion to change, to do more, to perfect oneself or one's surroundings, it is rarely born from a state of true wholeness. More often it arises from a split within the psyche, a conflict between who one is and who one imagines one must become. This inner division manifests outwardly as restlessness, over-efforting, and the incessant belief that life must be corrected at every turn. Beneath the surface of all this striving is a deeper disquiet, a sense that something fundamental is missing or out of place. But what is truly misplaced is not in the world. It is in the attitude of the ego toward the self. The ego, in its hunger for control and mastery, often becomes blind to the reality that the striving itself may be the very thing perpetuating suffering. When the psyche is unified and at peace, the need to force change dissolves. One acts when appropriate, withdraws when necessary, and responds to life with a sense of rhythm rather than urgency. But when the ego is cut off from the deeper layers of the unconscious, it loses its sense of internal timing. It begins to function like a machine with no intuition, no feeling, and no regard for the natural unfolding of events. In this state, action is not guided by wisdom but by fear, the fear of inadequacy, of failure, of falling behind in some imagined race. And so one begins to push, to manipulate, to calculate, thinking that salvation lies on the other side of effort. This over-efforting, though often praised by modern culture as ambition or perseverance, is in many cases a symptom of profound inner disharmony. The mind becomes addicted to doing because it cannot tolerate simply being. The stillness that would allow the unconscious to speak is avoided. In its place, a frenzy of self-improvement arises. New goals are set, habits are analyzed, routines are constructed, and 1,000 little tasks are performed in the hope that peace might be earned. Yet peace does not come. It recedes further, like a horizon that moves with each step forward. This phenomenon is not random. It has its roots in the archetypal structure of the psyche. The ego, by nature, seeks to maintain its own stability. When it feels threatened by failure, rejection, or inner emptiness, it responds with increased control. It tries harder, but the self, which resides in the unconscious and represents the totality of the personality, cannot be manipulated by willpower. It demands integration, not domination. It moves in symbols, not strategy. And when the ego refuses to listen, the self will often speak louder, through dreams, through symptoms, through life disruptions that cannot be planned away. To over-effort is to assume that the ego must carry the burden of change alone. It is to forget that the psyche is a self-regulating system. Just as the body heals a wound without conscious instruction, so too does the unconscious work toward equilibrium, if allowed. But it requires space, it requires stillness, it requires a relinquishing of the compulsion to do. This is where many struggle, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack trust. Trust in the process, trust in the unseen, trust in the wisdom that lies deeper than conscious awareness. When one is over-identified with the ego, they become addicted to outcomes. Every action must produce a result. Every day must show progress. But the soul does not measure in results. It measures in depth, in integration, in the aliveness of the inner world. The soul will not be rushed. It will not conform to the ego's timetable. And so when the ego pushes forward without listening, the unconscious pushes back. Anxiety arises, depression appears, relationships falter, not as punishments but as messages, indicators that the way forward cannot be found in more doing but in less. In fact, the need to constantly act is often a defense against facing what lies within. As long as the mind is occupied, as long as there is a goal to pursue or a habit to refine, one need not confront the deeper questions. Who am I without these roles? What do I fear will happen if I stop? What grief have I not faced? These are questions that cannot be answered in motion. They require descent, and the descent is frightening precisely because it demands the surrender of brawn. It demands the acceptance of uncertainty, of feeling lost, of not knowing what will come next. But herein lies the paradox. When the ego surrenders its frantic efforts and allows the deeper material of the unconscious to surface, what rises is not chaos, but clarity. Not immediately, not always comfortably, but inevitably. The unconscious does not seek to destroy the ego. It seeks to balance it. It seeks to reorient the individual away from superficial achievement and toward authentic wholeness. This can only happen when the split within is acknowledged, when the part of the self that is constantly doing is asked, gently, what are you trying to avoid? It is often in moments of stillness, or breakdown, or loss, that this truth begins to emerge when one is forced to stop, to sit with oneself, without distraction. Then the real conversation begins. The images that arise in such moments may be uncomfortable. They may show unmet needs, forgotten memories, or unexpressed emotions. But they are not the enemy. They are the missing pieces of the puzzle. The ego has been trying to solve through endless action, and once these pieces are allowed into awareness, the inner pressure begins to lessen. One sees that the struggle was not to achieve something new, but to integrate something old. Doing less, then, becomes a gateway. It is not laziness. It is not failure. It is the sacred pause that allows the unconscious to recalibrate the psyche. It is the silence in which the deeper voice of the self can be heard. This voice does not speak in commands or solutions. It speaks in images, in dreams, in subtle shifts of feeling. It does not shout, it whispers. And to hear it, the ego must become quiet. This quietness is not a passive state. It is an active receptivity, a listening, a watching, a willingness to let what wants to emerge without resistance. In this state, transformation does not come through force, but through alignment. The right actions begin to suggest themselves, not as tasks to be completed, but as expressions of a deeper rhythm. Life begins to feel less like a problem to be solved and more like a mystery to be experienced. Decisions are made not from fear, but from resonance. Paths open not because they were forced, but because the internal state allowed them. The conflict within, the tension between doing and being, does not vanish overnight. It is a dynamic that must be navigated again and again. But each time the ego chooses stillness over compulsion, trust over fear, integration over avoidance, the psyche moves closer to harmony. The compulsive need to act begins to fade. Not because there is no longer anything to do, but because the doing arises from the right place. It is no longer a reaction to fear, but a response to truth. It is important to understand that this process is deeply individual. There is no formula, no universal rule for when to act and when to wait. The unconscious speaks differently to each person, but what is universal is the principle that over-efforting, when it stems from inner conflict, leads not to resolution, but to repetition. The same patterns recur. The same frustrations arise, not because one has failed, but because one has not yet listened deeply enough. To recognize this is not a cause for shame. It is a call to awareness. It is an invitation to turn inward, to explore the motives behind the effort, to ask what the striving is trying to conceal. Often, it conceals a lack of self-worth, a fear of stillness, a dread of facing one's own inner world without distraction. But once these fears are named, they begin to lose their power. They no longer need to drive the bus. The ego can take a step back, and in that space the unconscious can step forward. This stepping forward is rarely dramatic. It does not come with fireworks or sudden epiphanies. It comes slowly, like the turning of a tide. One notices small shifts. A habit no longer feels necessary. A decision feels clearer. A situation that once caused anxiety now seems manageable. These are the signs that the inner split is beginning to heal, that the ego and the self are learning to walk together, rather than in opposition. The effort to change one's life is not wrong. It is the intention behind the effort that must be examined. When action arises from a place of fear, from a belief that one is not enough, it leads to exhaustion. When action arises from a place of alignment, from a connection to the deeper self, it leads to clarity. The difference is not in what is done, but in the state of consciousness from which it is done. Over-efforting then becomes not a necessity but a signal, a message that something within is out of balance. The proper response is not more effort, but more listening, not more striving, but more allowing. The psyche, like nature, has its own intelligence. It knows how to grow. It knows how to heal. It simply needs the space to do so. In a world that rewards constant movement, it is an act of courage to stop, to pause, to question the impulse to always do more. But in that pause, something deeper is found. Not the fleeting satisfaction of accomplishment, but the enduring peace of inner alignment. This peace does not eliminate action, it sanctifies it. It turns action into expression, into embodiment, into flow. When one learns to recognize the signs of inner conflict, and to respond not with more effort but with more awareness, then transformation begins to occur, not because one has forced it, but because one has allowed it, and in this allowing everything begins to change, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The human psyche is governed, not only by the willful actions of the conscious mind, but by the hidden mechanics of the unconscious, which operates beyond the grasp of ordinary perception. This unconscious layer of the self does not respond to demands or commands. It responds to permission. When we speak of allowing rather than forcing, we are not suggesting passivity but describing a fundamental psychological truth. Transformation unfolds most authentically, not when it is imposed but when it is invited. The more one tries to dominate the psyche, the more it resists. But when the rigid grasp of control is softened, when the psyche is given space to move in its own rhythm, something begins to shift. What was once blocked starts to flow. What was once frozen begins to thaw. What was once hidden begins to rise. This movement is not initiated by force. It emerges when the ego relinquishes its compulsion to dominate the process of change. The ego, by its nature, desires structure, predictability, and certainty. It believes that progress can be mapped, that growth can be scheduled, that healing can be managed like a checklist. But the unconscious does not abide by these rules. It follows the logic of symbol, not schedule. It communicates in metaphors, not metrics. Its language is that of dreams, feelings, bodily sensations, and unexpected encounters. When the ego insists on forcing a change, it often does so by repressing these signals, by denying their value, by overriding them with intellect or action. In doing so, it cuts itself off from the very intelligence that would guide it through transformation if only it were allowed. To allow rather than to force is to step into a different relationship with one's inner world. It is to acknowledge that there is a deeper self, a living reality within, that has its own intention, its own movement, and its own timing. One does not command this self. One collaborates with it, but collaboration is only possible through receptivity. The one who listens, who observes, who opens, who waits with patience and humility, is the one who finds that change has already begun without needing to be pushed. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is the quiet unfolding of natural psychic law. When one interferes less, the psyche integrates more. Consider the image of a seed. A seed does not need to be forced into growth. It contains within it the blueprint of the entire tree. What it needs is the proper conditions: soil, moisture, warmth, and time. The psyche is not so different. It contains within itself the pattern of wholeness. It knows at a level beneath thought what it is meant to become. When the right psychological conditions are present, safety, space, inner attention, and emotional honesty, the deeper self begins to emerge. But when the ego acts like an impatient gardener, pulling at the roots to make them grow faster, it does not accelerate the process. It disrupts it. This disruption takes many forms. It manifests as chronic anxiety, as inner conflict, as spiritual exhaustion. One believes that they are failing to change, but in reality the change is being smothered by excessive interference. The psyche needs air. It needs space to breathe. It needs to feel that it is not being hunted down by the critical gaze of the conscious mind. The inner self is not a machine to be fixed. It is a living entity that blooms under conditions of trust, of acceptance, of presence. And this presence is not passive. It is deeply active in its stillness. To allow is to create a sacred container in which the unconscious feels safe enough to surface. Much of what blocks inner transformation is not the difficulty of change, but the pressure to change in a certain way, on a certain timeline, according to certain expectations. These expectations are usually inherited from parents, from society, from cultural myths about success and happiness. The ego, internalizing these voices, begins to demand from the self a version of growth that is not authentic. It begins to compare, to judge, to criticize every stage of the process. In doing so, it places the psyche in a state of defense, and a defensive psyche does not open. It closes, it tightens, it hides. But when the pressure is lifted, when the inner narrative shifts from "you must change now" to "you may change when you're ready," the entire system begins to relax. And in that relaxation, the unconscious becomes more visible, dreams become more vivid, emotions become clearer, desires once buried begin to speak, fears that were frozen begin to melt into understanding. This is the work of allowing, not creating change from scratch, but removing the internal barriers that keep change from occurring naturally. True growth is not an act of force, but an act of listening. And listening requires stillness, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of receptivity. It is the ego stepping back, not stepping away. It is the conscious mind asking questions, not delivering commands. It is a turning inward, not with the intention to fix, but with the intention to witness, to allow the pain to speak, to allow the confusion to remain unresolved for a time, to allow the truth to reveal itself when it is ready, not when it is demanded. This attitude of allowance is not weakness. It is courage. It takes strength to wait. It takes strength to face the discomfort of not knowing. It takes strength to sit with the broken parts of the self, without trying to glue them together prematurely. The desire to rush in and repair is often a way to avoid deeper contact with the wound. But wounds do not heal because they are hidden. They heal because they are held, and holding in the psychological sense means allowing them to exist in consciousness without repression, without denial, without judgment. When one learns to allow the self to be where it is, rather than where it should be, a great weight is lifted. The psyche begins to reorganize itself around truth, rather than expectation. And truth is always simpler, always quieter, always more sustainable than the masks we wear to impress the world, or even to convince ourselves. The false self shouts. The true self whispers. And to hear that whisper, one must become quiet enough inside to recognize it. The unconscious is not moved by demands. It is moved by resonance. When something in the outer world touches something deep within, an image, a sentence, a feeling, it sets off a chain of events that cannot be planned. A memory surfaces. A pattern is seen for the first time. A decision once impossible now becomes clear. These shifts are not the result of strategy. They are the result of inner alignment. And alignment cannot be forced. It must be allowed. The mind often thinks that action will resolve the discomfort of misalignment. It rushes to change the job, the relationship, the routine. But if the action does not arise from a deeper listening, it only perpetuates the pattern. The outer circumstances change, but the inner state remains untouched, and so the cycle repeats. One begins again, hopeful, then restless, then disappointed, because the root has not been touched. To touch the root, one must allow themselves to go beneath the surface, to sit with the discomfort long enough for it to speak, and to trust that what arises is not random but meaningful. In this way, allowing becomes a form of devotion, a commitment not to passivity, but to authenticity. It is a choice to engage with life at the level of soul, not merely the level of appearance. And the soul, unlike the ego, is patient. It does not demand quick answers. It is content to live the questions until they unfold into clarity. This unfolding cannot be rushed. The moment one tries to speed it up, the depth is lost. The surface may appear improved, but the core remains untouched. Allowing also means welcoming what the ego resists. Pain, uncertainty, sadness, longing. These are not obstacles to growth. They are part of the terrain. When the psyche is allowed to move through these states without resistance, it begins to metabolize them. What was once feared becomes understood. What was once unbearable becomes integrated. And in that integration, energy is released. Energy that was once trapped in defense now becomes available for creativity, for love, for presence. This is why transformation often feels effortless once it truly begins. Not because it is easy, but because it is no longer being opposed. The river flows not because it is pushed, but because it is no longer dammed. The same is true for the psyche. When the ego steps aside, not out of defeat, but out of wisdom, the deeper self steps forward, and its steps are not chaotic. They are ordered in their own way, according to a map the ego cannot see but can begin to trust. Allowing also restores dignity to the process of becoming. It acknowledges that growth is not a race, not a performance, but a sacred unfolding. Each person's path is unique. Each soul carries its own tempo. To allow is to honor that tempo, to honor the seasons of the self, times of bloom, times of retreat, times of silence. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of life moving in its own rhythm. And that rhythm, when listened to, leads exactly where it must. To allow rather than to force is to remember that you are not the architect of your becoming. You are its witness, its steward, its co-creator. The deeper patterns of your psyche know what they are doing. Your task is not to redesign them, but to trust them, to create space for them, to be with them in love, rather than in judgment. This is the work. Not to dominate the self, but to allow it to speak. Not to force change, but to allow the truth to reveal itself. And in that revelation, everything begins to shift. Not by effort, but by presence. The human experience is, at its deepest level, an encounter with mystery. Within each person is a center that cannot be fully known. A silent axis around which the inner and outer worlds revolve. This center is not a product of the conscious mind. It is not formed by opinion, memory, or even identity as we usually define it. It is the ground of being itself, the source from which all sense of direction, meaning, and orientation arises. When one loses contact with this inner axis, life begins to fragment. Choices become reactive, meaning becomes elusive, relationships feel hollow, and existence itself becomes a series of disconnected impressions rather than a coherent unfolding. But when contact with this center is restored, the individual begins to experience something different, not clarity in the form of answers, but alignment in the form of direction. This direction does not always come in words. Often it arises as a quiet sense of yes or no, a bodily intuition, a silent pull that guides one toward or away from something without needing explanation. It is not logic, and yet it is not irrational. It is something older than logic. It is a knowing that arises from the whole self, not just the thinking mind. There is a common misunderstanding that purpose must come through action, that one's mission, one's calling, or one's identity must be validated through external behavior. But the deeper truth is that direction precedes action. The inner sense of where to go must come first. Only then can the movement outward be meaningful. When action is taken without this inner orientation, it becomes compensatory. One acts not because it is right, but because it is distracting. One builds not from conviction but from fear. One speaks not to express, but to avoid silence. And in this avoidance, the center is lost. What is needed then is not more activity, but the rediscovery of the inner compass that makes activity coherent. This compass is not found by striving for it. It is found by becoming still enough to hear it again. It speaks in the absence of noise, in the spaces between thoughts, in the depth of one's honest solitude. The world will offer many substitute centers. It will invite one to orient their life around achievement, around image, around approval, around ideology. These things are not inherently wrong, but they are outer constructs. They do not arise from the root of the self. They are inherited or imposed. When one lives according to these borrowed centers, life feels performative. Even success feels empty. The applause of the world cannot replace the still voice within. One may fulfill the expectations of others, and yet remain in conflict with the quiet truth inside. This conflict may not be loud, but it is persistent. It shows up in a sense of fatigue that no rest can heal, in a restlessness that no change of scenery can resolve. These are not problems to be fixed. They are signals to be listened to. They are signs that the individual is being called back inward, back toward the authentic axis of their own being. When the individual begins to attune to this inner orientation, something curious happens. The need to control outcomes begins to soften. One no longer feels the same urgency to make life conform to the ego's script. Instead, one starts to trust that if they remain connected to their own center, life will organize itself around that connection. This is not a passive trust. It is an active surrender. It is a recognition that control, as the ego understands it, is often an attempt to replace guidance with management. But life, when lived from the center, needs less management and more response. The individual no longer acts to secure identity. They act because the inner movement toward action is undeniable. This is the difference between action from fear and action from alignment. One drains the soul, the other renews it. There is a rhythm to this kind of living. It does not look impressive from the outside. It does not always produce results that can be measured or displayed. But it produces something far more important: coherence. When one's thoughts, emotions, intuitions, and behaviors are all in conversation with this inner axis, life begins to feel real again. The fragmentation dissolves. The inner war quiets. One no longer feels like a stranger to themselves. This is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of direction within suffering. It is the ability to suffer meaningfully, to endure not because one must, but because one knows it is part of the way forward. Without this inner orientation, even pleasure becomes hollow. With it, even pain becomes sacred. The rediscovery of this center does not happen through ideas alone. It often comes through crisis. When the outer structures collapse, when the role falls apart, when the plan fails, when the image is shattered, what remains is the opportunity to find what was always deeper than those things. It is not that the center is created in these moments. It is revealed. It was always there, but it had been covered by layers of distraction, noise, and inherited narratives. When these fall away, the individual is faced not with a blank space, but with an invitation to listen inwardly again, to ask not what should I do, but where am I being led? This question cannot be answered by consensus or logic. It must be lived. There is often fear in this kind of listening. The ego does not like uncertainty. It prefers the safety of familiar structures. But the center is not found in safety. It is found in truth. And truth, while it may not always be comfortable, is always clarifying. When one begins to live from this axis, they may find that some relationships fall away, that some ambitions lose their appeal, that some goals no longer fit. This is not loss. It is refinement. Life is making room for what is truly aligned. And this alignment is not a product of effort. It is the result of orientation. When the inner compass is restored, choices become simpler, not because life becomes easier, but because clarity replaces confusion. To live from the center is to become less reactive. One no longer chases every opportunity, responds to every demand, or bends to every opinion. Instead, one moves when the movement arises from within. This creates a kind of spaciousness in the psyche. One becomes less entangled, less scattered, less fragmented. There is an inner continuity, a thread of selfhood that remains intact through the changing seasons of life. This continuity is not rigidity. It is rootedness. The individual is no longer thrown off course by every wave, because they are anchored in something deeper than the wave. They are anchored in the stillness beneath the movement. This anchoring is not achieved by isolation. It is deepened through relationship, not superficial relationship, but the kind of connection that reflects the truth of one's own being. When two people relate from their centers, something rare happens. There is no need to perform, to impress, to protect. There is space for presence, for honesty, for silence. These are the relationships that nourish the soul, that remind the individual of who they are when all masks are removed. And these relationships are only possible when one lives from the center. Without it, relationship becomes a negotiation of personas. With it, relationship becomes a communion of essences. The challenge, of course, is that the world does not often support this kind of living. It rewards speed, productivity, visibility. But the inner axis moves slowly. It speaks in quiet impressions. It does not shout over the noise. It must be chosen. Again and again, one must return to it. Not in dramatic gestures, but in small acts of remembrance. A pause before reacting. A breath before speaking. A moment of stillness before deciding. These moments, while seemingly insignificant, are the portals through which the center makes itself known. And over time, as these moments accumulate, a different kind of life begins to take shape. A life that is not driven but guided, not performed but lived, not forced but allowed. There is wisdom in knowing that the way forward cannot be found by looking outward alone. The outer world changes constantly. Its rules, Values and rewards are in constant flux. To live from the outer alone is to live in anxiety, always adjusting, always performing, always questioning. But to live from the inner axis is to carry a compass that does not shift with the winds. This compass does not eliminate suffering, but it offers something greater than comfort. It offers coherence, a life that is integrated, meaningful, and rooted in something deeper than appearance. This is not the product of belief. It is the result of experience. One must test it, live it, stumble through it. There will be times of forgetting, times when the noise returns, when the axis is obscured. But even in these times, the compass is not broken. It is simply buried. The work is to return, to listen again, to trust again, to remember that the guidance is still there, waiting to be heard. And the more one returns, the easier it becomes to stay. The more one lives from the center, the more everything else begins to fall into place, not because it is managed, but because it is aligned. Direction is not a roadmap. It is a resonance. It cannot be copied, borrowed, or taught in formulas. It must be found within. And when it is found, life changes, not in dramatic explosions, but in subtle reorientations. What once felt urgent now feels irrelevant. What once felt confusing now feels clear. The outer world may look the same, but the way one walks through it is entirely different. There is a quiet power in this kind of direction, a power that does not seek attention, but radiates presence, a power that does not force its way, but reveals it, a power that does not need validation, because it arises from truth. When one ceases the endless striving to reshape the outer world and instead turns inward to rediscover the silent axis of their own being, a profound shift occurs. Not in circumstances first, but in perception, in orientation, in essence. Life no longer needs to be controlled. It only needs to be listened to. And as this inner alignment deepens, the external world slowly, quietly, and often without fanfare, begins to organize itself accordingly. You realize then, it was never about doing more, trying harder, or becoming someone else. It was always about remembering what was already within, waiting patiently to be lived. May you walk forward, not with haste, but with trust. Not with anxiety, but with stillness. And may you come to see that everything you need to begin has already been given. Good luck on your journey inward, and thank you for allowing these words to accompany you, even for a moment, as you return to the place where everything quietly begins to fall into place.